Dear colleagues, it's time to resume our conference, and I'm really happy to introduce our first plenary speaker, Professor John Bailyn, and since his talk is to be given in English, it's probably appropriate to introduce him in Russian. So, наш коллега, профессор Джон Фредерик Бейлин, профессор лингвистики университета Стоуни-Брук, Нью-Йорк, директор ежегодной летней школы для российских и зарубежных студентов The St. Petersburg Institute of Linguistic Cognition and Culture. Научные интересы Джона входят, как, наверное, все присутствующие здесь знают, генеративный синтаксис, исследование падежа, порядка слов и синтаксических передвижений. Он автор более 150 научных работ. Он также автор книги The Syntax of Russian, 2012 год, которая получила премию Американской ассоциации преподавателей славянских и восточноевропейских языков, а также автор многих влиятельных и цитируемых работ по синтаксису славянских языков. Кроме того, Джон большой друг российских лингвистов и российской лингвистики. Мы всегда рады научному и личному общению с ним и с нетерпением ожидаем встреч с ним и его докладов. Сегодня мы приветствуем Джона как приглашенного докладчика нашей конференции.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. It's really great to be here. I was here 3 years ago, I think, at the same event, in the same room, I believe. And it's really great to be back. I'm going to sit down because I can, and you can still see me. It's really rare that works. So what I want to do is, I think, bring a welcome message. And a kind of a warning. The welcome message is that the situation with Russian word order is not so terrible as some people would have you believe. And I think it's a little bit preaching to the choir here because most of you, I think, are Russian speakers or students of Russian language in some sense. And the warning is that it's very easy to panic intellectually when confronted with something that's a little bit different from what you're used to when you're working inside a certain kind of theoretical framework. Am I loud enough for you? Okay, good. So what I mean is that it does happen that on the basis of slight variation that doesn't work perfectly in your theory, people sometimes abandon that theory entirely, or they do something crazy to try to accommodate that, rather than considering sort of possibilities that maybe are a little bit more, I don't want to say conservative, that would be a strange thing for me to say. But I do think that there is, so the reason that the title says the fate of syntactic theory is that I think that there's a real danger right now in syntactic theory, how some theories are looking at word order variation, not necessarily just in Russian, but Russian has come up recently in this regard. This is a battle that I've been fighting for a long time, as some of you know. But it has a new front, new battleground. And I want to tell you about that. And the basic message is that things are not so bad. And we don't have to abandon our syntax that we love just because of a couple of slightly misbehaved constructions. Okay? And it's not a good idea to do that unless you absolutely have to, because the consequences can be kind of significant. Okay? So what do I mean? What I mean is that we know, and it's, as you know, you have the 6 basic constituent orders of Russian transitive sentence. All 6 of them are possible in different contexts. We know this. it does seem to be the case that, you see it sometimes said, well, this is possible in Russian, whereas in English, none of these are possible except for the first SVO order, subject, verb, object. But that's not true, right? That's too strong a statement for English. And although all 5 of the non-SVO orders are worth talking about, it's really the last one in my first box, the OVS order, that I want to talk about today. Because that's the one that has led people recently to do some strange things. And we don't want to give up what we have, which I think works fairly well for the sake of one construction. So I'm not going to talk more than just 2 minutes right now about the orders like OSV, which is a bit topicalization structure, some kind of big A-bar left periphery movement structure, which I've talked about a lot in other places. I'm not going to say anything much about VSO, which is possible in some kind of particular constructions in Russian, as you know. Посадил диатрепку, right? There's things to be said about that, but it doesn't seem to be a strange thing. We have languages for which that's the basic word order, and they're head initial languages, and there's, it's not, the derivation of that is fairly straightforward. There's even things like that in English with expletives and so on, although not transitive ones. The VOS order is a post-verbal subject thing that we find in Italian and Spanish and various other places, and there's a debate about how to derive those, but it's either movement of the big VO cluster over the subject, or some kind of extraposition of the or some combination of those. Those are not so problematic. SOV requires a little bit of an object shift or local scrambling, middle field scrambling that English doesn't do with normal direct objects. John, the book reads, is out. But we know that SVO languages do this with object shifts. Scandinavian languages do it, although you sometimes can't see it because the verb moves further. And the Romance languages do it with pronouns systematically. So all of these are kind of things that are not at all difficult to derive, and we don't have to say anything really unusual to handle them. Now we come to OVS. Now OVS, which is the object, verb, subject order, which I call inversion, and makes sense because the subject and objects are inverted, has the properties that the object is in some position, some people have argued in the subject position, and we have something like it in English locative inversion, right? Into the room walked John has interesting properties, and there's a literature on this. First of all, into the room, that prepositional phrase seems to be in true subject position. At least it has some true subject properties. So it's not just kicked out, topicalized. It actually seems to be in spec T because it passes some subject tests. That's possible. What's really weird about the construction is, how does the verb get before the subject in English? This isn't even an unaccusative, right? So you can't even play with that starting position in a low position as you can in there arrived a man. There, a man presumably starts low. But in into the room walked John, besides how to get allow the prepositional phrase to get into subject position, you also have to say something about why the verb is before the how and why and where. All of that, the verb can be before the subject. I actually think, although I'm not sure because I haven't worked on the English construction, that this is the same problem as Russian OVS. It's just English can't do it with a direct object. So you cannot say, of course, the books reads John, meaning John reads the books, right? You can't do that. So again, I forgot to start my clock, but I'll start it now at least. But I think it's the same puzzle. And I think when we get the final solution to how to handle this construction in Russian, we'll also have some insight into how to handle that construction in English. we have to then also handle the fact that it's more restricted in English than it is in Russian. Okay. So, English versions or things that are somewhat possible in English that cover all these different word order things are given in your second box. I'm not going to talk about them more than I already did. And what I want to go and do is turn to the next page and talk about the OVS construction and the analyses of it that are out there. Most of the talk is going to be about other people's stuff. I have something to say about it of my own at the end, and I have had before, but mostly I want to tell you about the other accounts that are there and how they all don't work. Okay? So it's kind of one of those things where through negative argumentation, we're only going to be left with a couple of options because all the existing options fail, including one of mine. Okay? So examples of the construction are given in 3. I won't read them except «Войну и мир» написал Толстой. I can read that. That's nice to say. Because it's true and, some of them are very simple things. Now, of course, Russian speakers, which is most of you recognize, that these are not available in every single context. You can't just come up to someone in some of these will not be the standard, they're not the standard word order. They're available in a very particular context. And whatever theory you have of the syntax of these things has to then fit into a larger theory of discourse usage and all of that information structure. And I'm not going to say much about that either, because my feeling always is in these things, if we don't understand the actual syntax of it, then how can we talk about its usage and its application? Or at least they're two separate questions. So let's worry about the question of what is the actual structural representation of this construction when we have it. And then how we use it and when we choose to use it will be a secondary thing. Here's some examples of it in 3, from Russian, from Czech, from Polish, and it's very common in all these languages. So I'm going to talk about 3 accounts of this construction that are in your box on page 2. Generalized Inversion, that's the title of an article that I wrote about this construction a while ago, over 10 years ago. In that, what you do is very simple. You move the direct object into the subject position, not higher, into the subject position, which has been also claimed to happen in scrambling languages like Japanese. It's just that the verb's at the end there, so it doesn't come out OVS. But it has, and that's Miyagawa's primary claim. It's very controversial there, but it has been claimed before. That gets you the O part. And then in my earlier version, the verb raised over the subject by head movement into T, which normally doesn't happen in Russian. That's been independently shown. That's not controversial. And that leaves you with OVS. The subject, on that account, stays at home, basically. So you have 2 moves, an object move and a verb move, giving you object, verb, subject. That's generalized inversion account. Other people have done similar things. That one's easy to describe. Remnant movement accounts are a little harder to describe, but let me try. So 4b. So you have an SVO structure, right? There's no doubt about that as your base structure. The subject moves somewhere out of the little VP, like always. Like usually always, right? So far, so good. What are you left with? You're left with a complex of verb plus object, right? And then one of two things happen. Either you move that whole complex up, but now you have verb, object, subject, and then you move the object out. That's a viable set of procedures. You move a large piece and then a smaller piece out of the larger piece. That's attested. The opposite is always ungrammatical. That's the proper binding condition, because if you move a small one first, then the big one has a gap. But if you move the big piece first and then the small one, everybody C commands their traces and everybody's happy, right? So that's perfectly possible. So subject gets out of the way, then verb phrase moves up, and then object kicks out. Object, verb, subject. So that piece where you move the verb phrase where the subject has moved out, that's the piece that's called remnant movement. It's everything that's left, the remnant after the subject moves out. Okay? There's another way you could do it, which is you kick the subject out, and then you do the little object moves to the edge of the VP, hopping over the verb. So now you've got object, verb. And then you move that remnant up. Then you get object, verb, subject. So they're both remnant movement, but how the object gets to the edge is either after the remnant move or before it. So that's the 1 and 2 versions of 4b. Either you do and RM here means remnant movement. It does not mean relativized minimality, if you've heard of that, because it's also always called RM. I realized that after I made the handout. This one's tricky because it's a very complicated derivation. I'm going to talk about why I think it doesn't work. And then there's base generation, which we call BG, right? Also not to be confused with, yeah, okay. And the idea here is that you don't do any derivation at all. You have some special ability in this language, but not in other languages, to just directly put the pieces in the places that they seem to be in the surface. It's very intuitively appealing. And this is where I think we have to be really careful because of the consequences of that move. Okay? So I'm going to spend more time on base generation than the others. Okay? So here's what I want to do. I want to show you what's wrong with all of them. And then see what's left as a possibility. So generalized inversion. The problem with generalized inversion, and many people pointed this out after the paper originally came out, is not the object moving into subject position. It's the verb movement into T. The verb movement into T predicts certain kind of other word orders. It predicts that the verb will have those qualities of a French verb that raises to T. It'll precede adverbs, verbal adverbs. And it was quickly pointed out by various people that you see in this box on the bottom of page 2 that just seems to be false. So these particular examples are from Irechko, with this, so it's an OVS construction with an adverb. And the adverb is this sort of idiomatic thing, but it's a verbal adverb, and it very much prefers to come before the verb and not after the verb. And if the verb had raised to T, you would expect the opposite. So you get the wrong word order with adverbs involved. And that's sort of the reason we don't think that verb raises to T in standard constructions in Russian, and so we don't think it raises to T in this construction either. And then Slusser went and did a corpus study of this business, and she found by trying to identify certain adverbs and certain verb combinations that you get adverb VS much more than you practically never get verb adverb S combination, which is what you expect if the verb raises to T. So that piece of the generalized inversion account seems to fail just because of basic interactions with other parts of word order. Now maybe you could save it, but it's a legitimate criticism. That's why I'm continuing to work on it, because the old account required that and doesn't seem to work. Other people have made similar arguments. There's another problem with the generalized inversion on the top of page 3, which is that the subject seems to behave like it's in subject position, not like it stayed home. Remember I said it stays home and the verb jumps over it. Well, if it stayed home, it might not have the ability to bind anaphors, and it has the ability to bind anaphors. Now, maybe you can bind anaphors from spec of little v, But usually the claim is, no, you have to raise into spec of t to bind the anaphors. That's why... It's okay. This is a nice musical interlude. I might burst into song. We have reason to think that you need to be in spec of t to bind anaphors, because datives can do it, non-nominative subjects can do it, prepositional phrases sort of can do it in Umignac constructions, and in a lot of languages we have reasons to think that you have other kinds of subject properties that are associated with spec of t. And if you have those properties here, then, or some higher position, then you probably didn't stay at home. And if you didn't stay at home, then generalized inversion account doesn't work. So that's all I'm going to say about that. That was my account, and I think some of it is right and some of it doesn't work. Remnant movement. Here we go. Now let's take a look at an existing, here, I'll put it over here. How's that? Yeah, thank you. An existing count of remnant movement for this construction, but for Polish. And this is Bailyn's paper, 2009. So he has a lot of functional categories that are called sigma and phi and F and focus. That's okay. Like, that's not part of my criticism. That's a separate issue of whether we want to have all those projections. But we give him that because that's a matter of your framework. So what happens here, I told you about this before, but here we go step by step in 8. First, the agent, that's the subject, moves out of the verb phrase. For him, it moves up to a fairly high position. Okay? Step 2, the entire TP that's left, that's a big old remnant, moves higher than that. So see, the agent is now, in step B, the agent is now on the right. So now we have the S on the right, okay? But now we have VO and then the S stranded on the right. And then you pull out your internal argument, which, look at the big tree in C, which could be an experiencer, it could be a goal, it could be a theme, the object of some sort. For him, it could be any of those. And you pull it up into a focus position, which is a little bit weird because it's not really the focused element in the sentence. But okay, call it a high peripheral position. And so that pulled up thing is object, inside the big remnant is the verb, and the subject is out on the right. So that gives you object, verb, subject. It's a derivation of object, verb, subject. That's how that one works. So what I want to do now is tell you what's wrong with that one. Well, this is fairly easy to show what the problem is. The problem is, think about what just happened. So it's better to look at my hands than your handout. I could have done them on the board, but it's okay. You move out the subject, and you move it out to some fairly high position. Then you move the verb phrase, or for him it's a TP, but something that includes the verb and the object, to an even higher position. And then you move the object to an even higher position. Well, you're way, way up in A-bar land when you do that. You are not anywhere near the A domain. You're outside of TP, and that's about where the left periphery and all the A-bar properties are found, whether it's topic of focus or other functional categories. So you do not expect the object, the OVS, the object, to be associated with any A properties, subject-like properties. But in fact, and this is what led to my original account, the object has all sorts of A properties. And that's why it can't be in such a high position. So they're listed there in problem number 1. I'll come back to them later and actually show them to you. So there's references forward. You don't have to go there yet. But if you don't expect to get out of weak crossover with this, maybe you could. It's not clear what the remnant movement works that way. But you certainly don't expect the object to be able to bind anything, because you can't bind from those A-bar positions. They're not binding positions. You have to bind from A positions. You bind from subject position or object position in some languages, but not from topic or higher position. And there's scope changes that happen also. That is, in this analysis, the object is way up there, just like it topicalized. So the OVS and the OSV look almost exactly the same in terms of where the object is. So we don't really expect them to have different scope properties, but they do. And so you have no story on those scope properties. There's also an interesting effect, which is that the entire construction can be embedded, which you also don't expect if you're using the highest left periphery. Maybe it's possible, but in Svetlana Antoniuk's dissertation, she also showed that in the OVS construction, the object behaves like a subject in terms of having problems moving. So we know that subjects have problems moving over complementizers. That's called the that trace effect. In English, it's horrible to move a subject over a complementizer. In this, and sometimes that happens in Russian too, in SVO. But in OVS, it also seems to be the case that the object now has trouble moving over the complementizer. Well, first of all, it's hard to be under the complementizer in this kind of derivation. And second of all, if you are somehow under the complementizer, you're right under the complementizer and you shouldn't be able to move out. And you can't. So it shows that if you're in subject position, you should have problems. If you're not in subject position up really high, it's not clear that you would have problems. So the data that you see in 9, which is from, now these are with scope elements, with quantificational elements, that's actually not necessary for this argument. What's crucial about this argument is just the fact that extraction of a subject in an SVO in 9a over a complementizer is pretty bad, but an object is right. So she took the OVS construction and embedded it and showed that when the subject is lower, it doesn't have this problem. And that's consistent with Italian and Spanish not having that trace effect violations when they have post-verbal subjects. So when the subject is not in that high spec T, then it can extract. So that's exactly what you find. And then when you flip it and you do OVS and try to move the object out. So when you do either SVO in 10 or OVS and try to move the objects out, you fail when you have OVS. So it looks like it's come from a subject position. So what this means is there's evidence that it's really in the subject position. So the object is really in the subject position. If the object is in the subject position, then that remnant movement analysis can't work because that forces the object to be much, much, much higher. So these data are a problem for that analysis. And then there's also this thing about principle C, which is another binding effect, that you don't expect to have this kind of binding contrast that you see. These are from Czech, from Kucherov's, I think, dissertation. You don't expect to have this kind of contrast there. So if you're in a high A-bar position, you should be able to, so what should happen is, in B, though there's no number there, which should be 10, E, B, or whatever, that object, the first phrase, if it's in a high A-bar position, it should reconstruct, and it should trigger a principle C effect in the reconstruction position. So there should be no difference in grammaticality between A and B. But there's a total difference in grammaticality between A and B, and that's associated with an A position. So all of this are arguments in the A versus A bar. What kind of landing site is the object in? The object seems to be in a position, and so the remnant movement accounts have nothing to say about that. So that's a big problem for them. Now, supposing you could say, well, okay, I have a high A position. That's my theory. I have a high A position. Well, then you would have done an A bar move and then an A move, and that usually is impossible. That's called improper movement. You can't follow A bar movement with A movement. So there's a secondary problem, even if you solve the height problem. That's problem 2 there. And then there's this business called criterial freezing, which is when you do a very A-bar type of move, you're not supposed to be able to ever do anything again. I don't really like that theory very much, but it is a common assumption that once you do something like topicalization, you're kind of stuck for further moves. And that the Remnant Movement account has nothing to say about that either. So they would have to go and fight that battle with Ritzy, and you don't want to fight battles with Ritzy, if you can avoid it. I don't really know what I think about criteria freezing completely, but it's quite prominent in the literature, so this is something that has to be handled. Okay, so here we are on the top of page 5. And what we're seeing is, so there are different kinds of skeptics about different kinds of negativity about an inversion analysis of OVS, what I originally proposed. One kind of negativity is, oh, those objects are just like any other topicalized object. So a chart like this one is to show that OVS and OSV, so OVS is our construction today, and OSV is just topicalization. What English does, books, John read. Just object moved way up high, everything else normal. With reconstruction, A-bar properties, all that stuff. And so the two constructions in Russian seem to be very different from each other in terms of a whole bunch of properties, most of which we just talked about. Object binding into subject, various, that trace effect that you see, the binding effects that you see, and the remnant movement accounts can't get these differences at all. So even though they get the right word order with a bunch of moves, and those moves have no motivation either. So I could have put that as problem number 4. What triggers these moves? But okay, you give that to them because remnant movement people need lots of unmotivated movement. Even if you give that to them, they can't account for the contrast in this chart. So that's enough on remnant movement in the sense that you'd have to get really into the details. Either the good, I mean, they're interesting accounts, and I think remnant movement happens, and I think it's not unreasonable to try to analyze things this way. There may be ways out of some of these problems. I'd be interested in that, and I'm not, in principle, this isn't the kind of thing that makes me really nervous. It's the next stuff that makes me really nervous, intellectually, you know. So it's just they have empirical challenges to make their accounts work and some theoretical challenges like motivating the movements. But it's not impossible to do, evacuate, move the remnant. That's not an impossible sequence of moves. It's been argued for other constructions. It seems to happen in some cases. So if it got the properties right, it wouldn't be unreasonable to do that. But it doesn't get the properties right. So because it doesn't get the properties right, people have started to do these strange things. And the strangeness that I want to talk about is the base-generated stuff. And there's two versions of this. There's a tradition of base generating stuff in so-called scrambling languages. In the Germanic languages, there's a tradition of this with Neeleman and various other people. I'm not going to talk about those. There's the Boshkovich and Takahashi thing for A-bar base generation way up top. Sort of hang it up there from the very beginning rather than scramble it, and then you move it down. Weird. Those I've talked about in other places. I want to talk about these two, which is early spell out, and that one will take me about 3 minutes to talk about, and then the more recent one. So early spell out is a dissertation by Van Gelderen a while back, which says, this is great. It says some languages just go directly from, I don't even understand how this works. They go directly from a sort of numeration type thing, like a bunch of pieces that you're working with on your space. Here they are, and that's how we do it. Then you put them together into constituents and make your sentence, right? But you don't put them together into constituents. You just go straight to the phonological order, the word order. You go straight from kind of the lexical items to the output. There's no syntax, basically. This is it's called early spell out. You spell out so early that you don't even have any syntax. That's really early spell out. That's like earlier than most people wake up. And Actually, it's a published dissertation. So if you're interested, I mean, it's an amazing attempt. What's also amazing about it is she said that happens in Russian, but it doesn't happen in Japanese. That a free word order language like Japanese, except for the verb final part, is not generated by early spell out. That language has scrambling. That what we usually think is some extra moves that derive word order. But Russian doesn't have scrambling. Russian has early spell out. And then it turns out Russia doesn't have early spell out for all the word orders, just for some of them, which makes it even weirder. And the other part of it is she doesn't say how. So what are we talking about? Subject, verb, object, right? Those pieces. What's a subject? Well, it's a DP, let's say, or something smaller, right? That's a constructed element. You have to construct that before you merge it with a verb and give it a theta role. You have to construct the DP. But if you have early spell out, you shouldn't even construct the DP. So the pieces of the DP should be scattered all over the place. And there's some of that. Maybe you could do left branch extraction with that. But then you would just so overgenerate nonsense, right? There's no restriction on this business, right? And she has some particular claims which are bizarre, but they're all false. All word orders are available. Okay, every partial structure will be opaque for extraction. That's just not true, and it doesn't follow from her theory. And the third one is that any two quantifier relations should be ambiguous. But that's also just not true. In fact, the problem is that they're not ambiguous enough. And that we know from the scope literature is a separate whole issue. And there's no constituency. There's no deep about the implications of there's no DP, there's no VP, there's nothing. There's just words spelled out in any order. So there could be languages like that. They would be cool languages, right? Except I don't think we'd be able to use them for communication very well. But they would be cool. I haven't met one, and Russian is certainly not one, because we have clear evidence for constituency, right? So she would have to actually revise it and say, you have some syntactic creation, and then at a certain point, you skip other steps and go to early spell, and it would have to be restricted in all sorts of ways, and then it becomes a different theory, and she hasn't worked that theory out, so I'm not going to do it for her, only to argue against it. Just leave it, right? Doesn't work. The one other problem I want to say about it is selection. How does a verb say, I need a prepositional phrase complement? How does a verb say, I need a DP complement? How does a verb say, I need a CP complement? We know that verbs do these things, right? Some verbs have to have a certain, you can't impose that in this system because you don't have a process of building little constituents to merge with bigger pieces, right? So there's no syntax. When you give that up, what else do you lose? I think you lose it. So this is where I'm saying now we're in dangerous territory, because it's a cool idea. It's possible that it happens to a certain degree, but if you just put it out there as a thing that's available, you lose everything we know about constituency and structure building and structure preservation and a whole bunch of other stuff. So let's go to the next one. The next one is kind of a modern version of that one, and it's a much more carefully worked out business than that one. And this is Titov 2013 in her dissertation, and 2018 in a paper that's out there on Lingbuzz. You can find it. And in fact, I sometimes say 2017 because it was out there in Lingbuzz in 2017, and then she revised it, and now it's out there in Lingbuzz in 2018. So I'm sorry, there aren't 3 works, there's 2. Her dissertation and this paper that's out there in Lingbuzz. So it just had 2 versions. Okay. So this is what she wants to do. She wants to generate OVS in the following way. She has no problem with building DPs, constituents. No problem with that. She doesn't have early spell out. What she has is, and here it is, the whole ball game is in some languages, you have the ability to flip the theta hierarchy and first assign the subject role when you merge with the verb. So let's call it agent and patient, or agent and theme. Take a standard transitive. Forget about experience or weird combinations, but just agent, verb, theme. John ate the sandwich, whatever. Okay? Normally, the reason we think the first merges with the direct object is because there's some kind of hierarchy of theta relations, that the lower theta role, like the theme, has to merge with the verb before the higher one. So that when you say John loves Mary, it can't mean Mary loves John. Except in the Russian OVS construction, it can. That's why we're talking about this, because you have to somehow derive that, right? But what she says is there are some languages, and the original theory comes from Neeleman and Reinhardt, and I think those references are here, and they use it for doing something very different, which I'm not quite as upset about, but that's because I don't know enough about Dutch. But they use it for doing the two internal arguments in Germanic languages, the accusative dative and the dative accusative. They say that hierarchy of theta roles, there's no agreement about what the right hierarchy is. There's Larson, a colleague of mine at Stony Brook, as you know, who has argued strongly that the theme is above the goal. And then there's the applicative people who do it the other way around. And there's a lot of little internal derivational moves that you can make. And there are some people who say the two orders are just differently base generated. And Neil Milan is like that. And he basically said, you can fiddle with which theta role you assign first. But that's all VP internal stuff. So it is possible that Neeleman is right about that, but this is still wrong. That's the most generous thing I'm going to say about it, right? Because the fact is he's probably wrong about that also, but I don't care today. Because today we care about objects and subjects. And when you're talking about objects and subjects, so Titov took Neeleman's idea and kind of went crazy with it. Right? And this is where you have to be cautious, because these things have extreme consequences. The idea is a cool idea. So you have to see whether it works or not. So if you look at this box at the bottom of page 13, it's a little hard to unpack this. So let me try. See the O, so the one on the left is SVO, and the one on the right is OVS, right? Now, there's going to be more movements. The subject's going to move to subject to a speck of tea later, like always, in both cases, I guess. Where the object, who knows what happens later. But it doesn't really matter what happens later, because this is what's important. So look what's different. Look at the bottom, the verb and its complement. In A, the verb has two theta roles to discharge, and normally it discharges the object theta role, the theme, first. You build the V bar. The other one is still to be discharged. You bring in a specifier. You discharge the other one, and that's how you build up structure. That's a standard canonical structure building. There has to be some reason that the theme always is merged before the agent, and there, Utah or theta hierarchy or whatever your theory of that is. There has to be some. They're ordered. They're in a bundle. There's various ways of doing that, but it happens standardly. So what she says is that sometimes in some languages you just have it the other way around. You have the ability to flip it and say, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to merge the verb with the agent first. So now in 13b, down low, the only difference in these two trees is which theta role has a little hashtag on it. So see, when you get up to V bar, the little hashtag is on the different one. That's the one that hasn't been done yet. That's the one that remains to be done. So basically, you have two theta roles, an agent and a theme, and first you merge with the agent, and you create a little thing. I don't want to call it a constituent, but it's a constituent. So, okay, I'll call it a constituent. But it's a constituent that consists of the subject and the verb and doesn't include the object. That's a weird looking constituent. But okay, that's the theory. And then the object comes in where the subject normally comes in, and therefore plays the role of kind of a subject. Okay? Now, before you even turn the page, just think for a second, you realize that she has one thing right. It's going to work well. The object is going to have all the subject properties. You're going to get all the A properties for free because it's going to bind anaphors. It's going to go to the spec of T, probably, and then it's going to be subject to the that trace effect, like Antoniuk noticed happens. It's going to you're not going to get we cross over because there was no movement crossing anything. So a lot of the A properties which were behind my original inversion account, you're going to get. So it looks like it doesn't have any of the issues the remnant movement people have. That's good. Okay. Turn the page now. So I don't really want to spend a lot of time on those A properties, except I do want to show them to you because they've been controversial. Like Slusser said, oh no, there are no A properties in this construction at all. That's my footnote on the previous page. Read it later. Don't read it now. That's a different argument. If she's right, it's an empirical argument. If she's right, then Titov's in even worse shape, but I'm a little bit in trouble too. I think that's why I want to include them, at least the A properties. So here are the primary A properties, which are when you move a WH phrase in build an OVS construction that includes a WH phrase. So that's something like 15b. For a lot of people, this is okay. You don't have a crossover effect like you do when you normally move a WH over a pronoun that's co-indexed with it. So kavo and yivo can refer to the same person in 15b. Not true in 15a. The same is true with quantifiers. So in the OVS construction, it's quite well known in 16b that you can have a quantifier and a bound variable, that's каждую девочку, and then a bound variable, ее мама, lower, and you don't get a crossover effect, which you normally do with quantifier raising. And the reason you don't get it is because it's not in an A bar position, it's in an A position. So that works for Titov and it works for me. It just doesn't work for the remnant movement people. The same has been shown to be true in Polish by Invilan's paper, so on. The other A properties we've already seen, the ability to bind anaphors, like in 18b in the OVS construction, which comes from Titov's dissertation, but is well known. I think those facts came from Levine and Frieden originally, right? And the thing is, this is a tricky thing. So now, forgetting about the handout for a second again, to what degree does the object really bind into the subject? Well, it does in these reciprocal cases, but in straight anaphors, it's sort of mixed. There are some cases where it kind of does, better than a topic, which never binds. And you can show that, like a really A-bar thing. But it's not totally fine in all the cases, which is what I was hoping for in 2004. I was young and naive, and I wanted everything to be beautiful and all that stuff. So it's mixed, and your theory has to account for why it's mixed. That's going to be tricky also. But it certainly is possible that they can bind some anaphors, like in 18b and in 19b, and these are taken from other people's work, so if you don't agree with the data, talk to them. But at least there is some of that, and these are the A properties that we know. And then there's the scope business. Now, the last thing you want to do is start to talk about scope, right? So I won't. We'll let Svetlana and Tanya Yonin, fight this one out. But there's actually kind of a consensus growing that the OVS construction. So the question is, if the subject is a quantifier and the object is a quantifier, what are the scope relations? In SVO, it's controversial in Russian. Some people say it's frozen scope only, and other people say there is an inverse scope possibility. So there's a big debate about that. The question, that's not quite our question. Our question is the SVO construction different in scope from the OVS construction? That is, of course it's different, but is it, right, is it analogous? So are they both frozen scope, or are they both ambiguous scope? Because the Titov account predicts that this is direct generation. So this should have frozen scope with this, or there should be some way of getting the other scope. But there's no reason in the world why the OVS should have different scope possibilities with respect to the surface than the SVO should, right? Because think of anybody else's account of this. Anybody else's account of this starts from SVO. Mine, Remnant, yours, doesn't matter. SVO, and then a derivational move. That the object somehow or other in a remnant or by itself moves over the subject. That immediately changes the possibilities of what the scope options are. But for Titov, direct generation, it's either S generated here and O generated there. That should have a certain scope effect. Or it's O generated here and S generated here. That should have the same effect. And so if they're different, you're in trouble. And they're different. And here's what Titov says in 21. She compares a passive to an OVS. And she claims that the passive is, and she gives scenarios and all this stuff. She claims that the passive is ambiguous. I mean, it's sort of hard for the same two lecturers to be fired by a lot of different universities, right? But they could have multiple jobs and then just really screw all of those jobs up, and the same two lecturers could be fired by every one of the places that they work at, right? So she says that's possible in 21A, but the standard interpretation is that at each university there were two different lecturers who got fired. That's the inverse scope reading of 21A, and she says that that thing is not available in 21B. That's her judgment. I put it in a circle. Now, if you can find that's good. If you can find thank you. If you can find a place where Antonyuk and Yonin agree about scope, you're making progress, because they disagree about everything. But they both agree now, it's in the more recent Yonin-Luchkina papers, that the OVS construction is at least possibly ambiguous, and that's what's shown in 22. Okay? And if that's true, then they're different. Now, what I want to do is tell you what her additional arguments for base generation are. The A properties of the subject, Raji Boga, right? Her other argument, the paper has 2 pages of syntax. That's it. And I'm only talking about those 2 pages. Her theory of discourse, when you use this and how it's applied and why we use a marked construction in a certain, that's a whole different thing. That could be totally right, but the derivation could still be totally wrong. So I'm just talking about the syntactic arguments. The A properties, fine. The rest of her argument is basically, well, the alternative fails. And one alternative is, it fails because there's no verb to T raising, so my original account fails. Okay, we talked about that. And you should never be able to move an object over a subject because of relativized minimality, the other RM. You should never be able to move an object over a subject. If you have a good theory of scrambling features, that is not a problem, because the subject won't have a scrambling feature, or whatever the feature is, and the object will, so they won't be in competition. So that's a non-argument, actually. And then there's only one other argument, which is this one, which she says, because she wants evidence that the verb merges with the subject. That's what she needs. That's actually kind of a constituent. Well, she says there's idioms like that, where the subject and the verb form an idiom that doesn't include the object. Like, this one in 23. Vana mina aleta chasha. Or you're supposed to say chasha siya, I heard, because that's the traditional thing. And there's another one, paputulukai. And she says, look, here they are. Whoops, that's them. These are idioms of that low piece that she proposes. But you get SVO versions of the same idioms. In fact, I found a poem that's called Chashasi Amino Alaminya. SVO. So how is that idiom work? So you need a theory of idioms, and it's not the theory that they have to start as constituents, because then you would never get this thing. And then there's lots of idioms that have the opposite problem, that are standard verb and object type of idioms, and they shouldn't be able to participate in OVS constructions, and they can. So that's also a problem for her. So that's something like 26, that you can do an OVS construction with that, it still has its meaning. So you have to be able to manipulate idiomatic constructions. They don't tell you anything about base structure. Well, maybe some things, but they don't tell you what she thinks that they tell you, which is that you have to be merged together and stay that way. There's evidence for notice the other thing about Titov's account is there's no VP. There's no traditional VP. A VP is a verb and object. There's no traditional VP in an OVS construction. So you shouldn't have VP ellipsis associated with an OVS construction. But you have VP ellipsis perfectly fine associated with an OVS construction in 27. Seems fine. I want to add one more argument and then quickly tell you some alternatives. The one argument left is, if she's right that object is merged where we usually have subject, and subject is merged where we usually have object, then the situation with extraction out of those, sub-extraction, should be flipped from what we usually have. And what we usually have is, it's much harder to move out of subjects than it is to move out of objects. And moving out of objects is easy. Moving out of subjects is hard. That is the constraint on extraction domains, right? Moving out of subjects and adjuncts is hard, but out of objects is fine. So it should be flipped. And if you look at it, so the data that shows you that from English are in 28 and 29. Who did you buy a picture of? Moving out of an object is fine. But who does a picture of hang on the wall is terrible. That's 29, because you're moving out of the subject instead of out of the object. This is very well known. So in Russian, the same is true. If you in SVO, if you move out of an object, it's fine. Fine. The achom is moved out of the direct object, right? But с чем писатель написал статью, and not what did he use to write it. That's a verbal modifier. But what's this писатель with? Like с длинными волосами is the answer to the joy. Totally impossible, right? Completely impossible that the answer to с чем писатель написал статью would be с длинными волосами. Unless he used the hair to write the article. But then it's a VP modifier. So now we test if that same thing is true in OVS, and it doesn't change. You can still move out of the object, now even when it's in first position, in 31A, much better than you can move out of the subject. And so she has no way to account for that. Whatever your account of the constraint on extraction domains is, it fails there. It will predict that objects behave like subjects and subjects behave like objects as extraction domains, but they don't. It has something to do with being an initial object that allows you to be transparent. So we have a paradox which is listed in 32, which we want the A properties for the O that's out front. We don't want verb raising to T. We don't want to go way up into the high left periphery. And also we want to get the subject in the last position. So it seems like the only thing that's possible, see, if remnant movement doesn't work, and if base generation doesn't work, and if object and verb hopping doesn't work, we have to have, and I won't go into details of it because I'm out of time basically, and also because I don't have details of it, but it seems like by negative argumentation, we're down to saying that we need to have a position on the right for the subject. we need to either have a right specifier or movement to the right of the subject, so that we could maintain from my original analysis the object movement into the A position to get the A properties. And we have to move the subject to the right, either move or base generate the subject to the right of the verb, and the verb doesn't do anything interesting. So it is an inversion construction, but you need either right specifier, which is non-orthodox, or you need rightward movement, which is non-orthodox, but not impossible. And then I think you can get all of the properties. And I don't think there's any other way to go, because all the other derivational accounts have the problems with A and A bar or with verb moving that we showed. And the base generation account leads you into, okay, people could be unhappy about rightward attachment or rightward movement, but they should be way more unhappy about base generation. Because base generation, you lose constituency, you lose any kind of sense of a theta hierarchy, of any kind of ordering of these operations, and there's just absolutely no explanation for why we have all the restrictions that we do have in a language like this. So one possible version of a hybrid, so I call it a hybrid. It's partially generalized inversion, and it's partially movement to the right, or base generation to the right, and there's a tree of how it might look. Nothing really interesting happened here. The object moved to subject position, and the subject is adjoined on the right of VP, and you get object, verb, subject, and you get the right properties. You have subject properties for both the subject and the object, and you have the A properties for the object, and you can do that kind of derivation. So we'll go to the conclusion now. Last minute, the hybrid on page 10, the hybrid account can, we don't have to do the verb raising, we don't have to do the remnant movement, we get the A properties for the object. The subject could be an adjunct, or it could be a specifier on the right. We already know that spec of T is not just for nominatives, it's for other kinds of elements in some languages. And we don't have to panic and go for base generation, which leads us into much more trouble than something like this does. The end. Or maybe the beginning.
Dear colleagues, as John has demonstrated in his entertaining and profound talk, once syntax is a dead serious thing, and he is one of the very few human beings who can do it. So please, the floor is open. Please, questions.
First of all, how does example 7 correspond to the full fourth page? They seem to almost directly connect.
Wait, sorry. Well, example 7 and what?
And the full fourth page.
What?
Example 7
seems to contradict the full page number 4. Because example 7 says we don't is said to say, is trying to say that subject is inspected.
And how? And what are you saying that? Right.
B seems to say object is inspected. Do you have multiple specifiers for this or what?
It's not impossible. There's multiple, it's a very good question, because what I said at the very end, and I said it too quickly, I talked a lot about the A properties of the object, and what you noticed is the one time that I talked about the A properties of the subject, so you do need to have both. Now, it's not, I said, maybe there's a right specifier, but if there's a right specifier, there's a left specifier also. That's pretty crazy, but it's not impossible. We know that there's multiple specifiers. That's not controversial in the CP domain, unless you're a cartographer. Okay, but if you're not, there's multiple specifiers. There's a C for multiple WH movement, for multiple subject constructions, at the VP edge, there's multiple specifiers for escape hatches. Multiple specifiers are not such an amazing thing. It's just having one on each side would be weird, and that might be what you need. Or you get the subject properties of the subject out of little, from spec of little v, T, you get the subject properties of the object in spec of T, and then the subject does some subsequent move to the right. So all you need is two A positions, and you have two A positions, spec of little v and spec of T. So you're right that you need to be careful about the subject position of the S properties, but I think you have it from its base position or a specifier on the right. So I think it's a good point. We have to be careful, but I think it can be handled.
We have no questions. Sasha,
Just one question. One about page number 6. I don't refuse the fact that there is a contrast between 16A and 16B, but it seems that OSV is sometimes unacceptable even without words that should lead to weak crossover. For instance, it's okay to say каждую девочку кто-нибудь любит, or the OSV, but it's stranger, it's less acceptable to say каждую девочку один парень любит. Although it's fully acceptable to say каждую девочку любит один парень. So I don't use these examples. I only want to say that contrast between OSV and OVS can result from factors other than weak crossover effects.
That's a really interesting contrast. So if that contrast is true, at least so that's a good thing in the sense that the Slusser type of analysis that says that all objects are in the same place is probably wrong, right? And that we just have to have an account so that's a scope business, right? It has something to do with the scope relations between Kajli and Nadine. And so it goes into the issue of what happens when you do different kinds of movements and how it affects scope and what reconstructions are possible. I don't really have a theory of scope, but the scope people at least should take that contrast seriously. And if we give them two different syntaxes, they can run their scope theory on two different syntaxes. So at least we'd be helping them. That's all I can say about that.
I saw several more hands. Sorry. I said, and then can one.
Yes.
I'm wondering what would happen if you throw another element in the mix, if we throw in an indirect object.
Yeah, I know.
What its position is going to be,
Yeah.
and whether that'll help us decide between these analyses.
Yeah.
or whether or not
It's a fantastic question. Somehow they're just
I'm
get.
not sure what my judgment
Yeah, I'm not sure either, and we should talk about it more. I've thought about the question, but when
7A, that seems to God, yes, but I think it's because it's also idiomatic that might have
Yeah.
done that.
Yeah, and what does happen there, just since it's, right, yeah, right, because the vzácná себя might be some kind of complex. But I mean, so some of the accounts claim that that the subject is always absolute last. And that seems to be false. So Irechko claims that, and it motivates her analysis. But that seems to be false. There can be something after the subject. So you could have OVS indirect object. But they don't seem to have or PP, which is, so second object or adjunct inside VP. They don't seem to be very good sort of even if you move all binding scope out of the way and just go with basic elements, they just don't seem to be so great. So now, suppose that's true. Suppose it's like, this is a construction that only functions when you have two arguments, and it doesn't even function, it's not even available when you have three arguments. Why would that be? Right? I don't think that favors one theory over another, but it's just a really interesting fact. And notice that English locative inversion has exactly that property. And quotative inversion, right? Hello, said John, but not hello told John to his friends. They can't be, there's a transitivity restriction. So that's like, these are really mysterious properties of inversion constructions. And so that's a great direction to go, and maybe it will help us figure out what's going on. Thank you. Because I had thought about it, but not recently, so yeah. What happens?
Yeah, I'm not sure
okay with the multiple step hypothesis, like generalized like article. But in your analysis, there are two specifiers. One is on the right and one on the left.
Maybe, yeah.
Is there any such language, and do you have any motivation for this?
Well, just as the only possible analysis of this construction. No, I don't insist that it be a right word specifier. It could be a movement to the right, like we used to have, extra position of the subject, from spec of little v to adjoin to VP, or maybe adjoin to TP. Right? And it gets its A properties in its base position. It doesn't go through normal subject position, and then it moves out to the right. That's more palatable than a right specifier. But, but maybe there are cases where you could have a right specifier in the V domain and a left specifier in the T domain. That would be, then we would want to see other languages do stuff like that. Yeah. No idea.
I think I have a follow-up, sort of. So, if we adopt, for instance, the bare phrase structure or its spirit, right, then there is no difference between specifiers and adjuncts, in a sense. So we have just internal merge for free. So then there will be no problem, I think. There will be basically no difference between two specifiers. First of all, and second, I think the motivation for the adjunction, more for the second specifier, would be strictly information structural one. So we just need to have the subject sentence finally in order for it to have the right properties of being a focus, I think. So we typically have focus either VP finally or sentence finally in Russian.
Right.
So, but subjects are not for the typical foci, right? So in this kind of word orders, we must have a topical object and a focal subject, which are both not the canonical kind of thing, right? Exactly. And the verb is distress, so indeed I think nothing happens. So it's like, it seems that the tree structure that you propose really does capture this kind of.
Right, so, yeah.
So you can really this structure really feeds into the information structure, I think.
Right. I totally agree with you. And Titoff's article is primarily about that issue. So she says, here's how you make an OVS. I disagree with that. But then she says, here's why you use an OVS, and it's for exactly those reasons. You have a non-canonical mapping onto information structure for which this is, but you need a syntax for it, right? Yeah. So I want to say one more thing on that, which is, it's not entirely the case that bare phrase structure treats adjuncts the same as specifiers. Specifiers have theta roles, and adjuncts are whatever adjuncts are. It's cartography that says that all what we used to think are adjuncts are specifiers, but that's not necessarily so. But yes, I agree. It's not a problem on the right. It's nice.
Well, your whole argument against the remnant movement is argument against high remnant movement. But let's say we have a position between little v and p. If we move the verb phrase to the specifier of this, say, SP.
Yeah.
And then we move object from the specifier SP to spec TP. Won't we derive all the same without needing to resort to whatever you name it, right word something?
Right, so that's yes, it's possible. And that's that's sort of like Irechko's analysis. Because Irechko does acknowledge the A properties and does want to put the extra structure for the remnant movement in that exactly where you said, between VP and TP, and do the little remnant movement there. The only problem there, so that could be it. The only problem there is that the remnant move into that intermediate space, whatever it is probably a bar movement itself. And then you're doing a movement out of a bar movement. So that might be problematic in a technical point of view, but maybe you can get around it. And if you can get around it, then that is a viable alternative. Yeah. Of course, if this remnant move is driven by anything criterial, like topic and focus, that should freeze the next move. But those are technical issues. It's the best possible version of remnant movement for these facts. Absolutely. In fact, the only possible one. I agree with you. Could be looked at. Yeah.
Well, if I'm allowed, one more question. Sorry.
Yeah.
Very short question. I think that this ODS order is often employed in WH questions to objects.
Yeah.
And so, well, кого встретил Вася?
Right.
Do you think that the underlying structure for such questions is what you will show us in 35, or are they derived from some other way? So, to have that structure, to have
I mean, a lot of the A data, the A evidence, like lack of weak crossover and all of that, binding and stuff, is with WH questions. So I would assume that you first do this and then you do the WH movement, just like a WH passive, who was killed by whatever, where you first do your construction with your A movement and then you do the WH.
Then the word order in WH questions follows from the general picture of OVS sentence.
Yeah, first you create an OVS sentence, then you do WH movement. Or you don't create an OVS sentence, and then you do WH movement. Yeah, I think I don't think that makes things worse. I think it's, I think.
Well, I think we are done. We have to thank John and everybody.
Coffee.